Welcome back. Our next session is entitled Diversifying Digital Collections, Reflections from the Ahmed, Iqbal, Ullah Race Archives and Community Engagement Center, known as the AIU RACE Centre. DAM plays a central role in examining so many issues about return, repatriation, repair, about decolonizing data, and in some very specific ways. And I'm so thrilled that we have the chance to have this presentation. If, by the way, you're looking for Ingenium, please do head over to track 2. While we have our presentation here from the AIU RACE Centre, send your questions along in the Q&A tab at any point throughout. It'll be my role to keep us on track and pass those along. We'll get to the ones later that we don't have time for during the live session. Safina, Jane, and Dipanshi, please introduce yourself and welcome to the Henry Stewart Conference.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm going to first of all ask Jane to introduce herself.
Thanks, Safina, and thank you, David, for the introduction. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And we hope we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to have a bit of a conversation about our reflections around digital asset management and the work that we both do. So to introduce myself, I'm Jane Gallagher. I am Head of Digital Special Collections and Services at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library. And this is part of the University of Manchester in the northwest of England in the UK. So we call it the Rylands for short, and it also consists of the historic John Rylands Library building, which is in the centre of Manchester, for those of you who know. So the Rylands is primarily a library. It's a research institute, but we also do a lot of teaching with our students, and we are also open to the public. So we have galleries and where we do our exhibitions. We also have a widening participation education outreach programme, and we're very much focused on the university's research agenda. And so that's really what drives us. In terms of my work, I support physical services, so that's things like the reading room, visitor services and building care. I'm also a curator of physical material. But I lead on digital initiatives with special collections material in particular. And I also manage our amazing and sector-leading imaging photography team. So our digital initiatives that we're currently working on as a team include areas of digital preservation and access. We've currently got a couple of high-profile projects going on with email access and preservation as part of our collections. Also looking to open up our digitized collections more and seek better preservation and access for those collections which are born digital as well. So Safina, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
You can. So yeah, I'm the head of the Ahmed, Iqbal, Ullah Race Centre and Education Trust, and we are part of the University of Manchester Library as well, part of their special collections. We are a collections-based anti-racism organisation with an archive and a library, and our work focuses on documenting the history of race relations in the UK, as well as archiving and collecting the experiences of culturally diverse communities, particularly in Greater Manchester, but not limited to Greater Manchester. And we provide access to our collections for academic research, educators, teaching, for community historians. I suppose so my role is to oversee sort of the day-to-day running of the centre and the Education Trust. And I describe myself probably not as a heritage professional or even a digital professional, I would say. I'm a community engagement and inclusion specialist that gets to work with these amazing stories. And I suppose today I'm going to share some of the challenges, some of the opportunities that the nature of our collections has allowed us to kind of explore. So I'm going to start with asking Jane, first of all, though, to talk a little bit about the kind of digital assets that she works with at the Rylands. And we're going to kind of do a bit of a compare and contrast, aren't we?
Absolutely, yeah, and look at the different ways in which we work and what we can learn from each other. So ironically, to start with the digital assets of the Rylands, I'm going to start with the physical, perhaps because I'm very much a curator person. So the Rylands and the University of Manchester Special Collections is an incredible set of collections. It's very much historical. It spans about 5,000 years from cuneiform, papyrus, manuscripts, maps and print, several hundred languages from all across the world. But we are now in the digital age, obviously, with emails and born digital records. So our digital assets comprise those born digital records, but also an amazing wealth of digitized content from our physical materials. So that's really what we're talking about at the Rylands in terms of our digital assets. So as I mentioned, we have a fantastic imaging team who are specialist photographers, and they're expert in capturing images of the historical materials. They've done some amazing work, including quite recently some research into how to accurately depict gold on a page, on one of those lovely illuminated manuscript pages. How can you really get that to show in the digital environment? That's been really fantastic. As well as that, our photographers work with advanced imaging techniques such as photogrammetry, which is 3D for the uninitiated, reflectance transformation imaging, and multispectral imaging as well. And so we use these to investigate the collections in more detail and support research. And so there's an extra challenge there in terms of how we store and make accessible that kind of information as well. So in terms of the digital systems and tools, we have quite a wide range of these that help us to store, to preserve and enable access to our digital assets. So this includes Luna, which is our digital asset management system for images. We now also have Manchester Digital Collections and Manchester Digital Exhibitions, which are all about access to the collections. We use Preservica as our preservation layer, and we also recently acquired georeferencer software. So we've got an awful lot going on in the digital sphere. And as I mentioned before, it's all really driven by this research initiative and getting our colleagues from the wider university to come and work on the collections. So Safina, can I ask you to tell us more about the Race Centre, its collections and some of the amazing work that you do?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we're one of the few sort of national heritage organisations that actively collects, preserves and provides access to the stories of Black, Asian and ethnically diverse communities, which are currently underrepresented in the UK archives. One of the biggest ways that we do that and central to our collections is our oral history collections. And they typically are the life story format. A lot of them, although they're in digital formats now, they were collected pre kind of digital platform or social media era. So they don't necessarily have all the permissions and the things in place that you'd need to share them in an open access way. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We've also got collections with visual sort of photographs, videos, images. We've also got a lot of documents and a lot of material that relates to race, racism and anti-racism work within the UK, spanning the last 60 to 70 years. Our work through our sister organisation, the Trust, supports local community groups that have an interest in heritage projects, running sort of community-led projects is what I would say makes us kind of unique and sector leading. We work with them to centre the needs of their communities, to develop projects where their voice and their narrative is central to what is collected, and then hopefully later archived with us. And more recently, we started during the pandemic our COVID-19 collecting project, which was aimed at collecting the marginalised and hidden stories of the pandemic, particularly through the lens of groups and individuals who are racially minoritised and were disproportionately impacted by COVID. And these stories aren't necessarily represented in what's collected. And this is our first kind of fully born digital archive as well. And it contains lots of different things, from photographs, films, poetry, personal accounts, and things that people just wanted to share about their experiences. So as I mentioned, we're located within Manchester Central Library, which is open to the public and is slightly different to the sort of the on-campus setting, and we have sort of lots of opportunity for people to engage with our collections, both physically and digitally. And I suppose what's really important about the work that we do is that when the communities develop their projects and curate their own stories, they get to deposit them in a place that has local sort of civic importance and is accessible to everyone. Yeah, I think, Jane?
Yeah, I think it's really important as well, isn't it, that sense of access for a whole community. And while we look at the Rylands and with the university in particular, and Safina, we've had a lot of conversations around this, we're really looking to put things out there, make as much available as we possibly can. So obviously with the Rylands and the wider university, we still have the issues around things like copyright, intellectual property, ownership. But because so much more of our material is historic, we tend to run on a kind of a risk managed approach, which is a lot easier. We have had some opportunities recently, particularly with our email collection, to try and work with some donors to look at what can we make available publicly without contravening any of those kind of that legal framework, I suppose. So things like harvesting data from email collections and putting that out as big data, and whether that's something we can do. So all those kind of conversations. But we very much operate on a kind of open access model through the university, which the university leads on, using such sort of standards, I suppose, as AAAF and TEI to make things really available. We use Creative Commons licenses to put things out there, and try and make sure that we're addressing all of this when we look to renegotiate any deposit agreements, or when we have any of those conversations with donors. So I suppose for us, open access is absolutely essential, and it feeds into a wider narrative, if you like, across higher education in the UK, that we ought to be providing more access to everything we do in a global world, really. Part of this, I think it's fair to say, is the narrative we've currently got in HE in the UK, that is the fact that it's funded very much by taxpayers. And obviously we want to be able to put things out there for those taxpayers to enjoy and to learn from. It's kind of moral obligation as well. So it's straightforward when we're talking about historic collections, and at the Rylands we're lucky that the vast majority we can make available in a risk managed way. But Safina, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts around how that works for more modern collections, and also the idea of how open is open access when we talk about it in the way of just putting things out there.
Yeah, so it is a really interesting point for us. There's a slightly different emphasis for us on open access. So I would say that it's open to everyone. Doesn't just mean about putting everything, digitizing everything and putting it out there. While we've got a really contemporary collection in comparison to the Rylands, a lot of our collections came before, the sort of pre-digital era. So there's lots of complexities around how you share that material now. We've also got a large book collection. Again, a lot of those are quite old texts and they're kind of out of print. They were done with quite small sort of independent publishers, black publishing houses that aren't necessarily around anymore. So to get the permissions to digitize, those are really difficult. There are also issues around sensitivities regarding the content. We have got a lot of difficult stories, challenging stories around the history of race, racism, and I think particularly in the context of our oral histories, where there are still living descendants and there are still sort of family members, peers, colleagues around, we have to spend quite a lot of time making sure that nothing goes out there that could impact anyone else. There's also a lot of outdated and difficult sort of language, concepts and terminology around racism. that are in some of the texts and some of the collections. For example, we've got a large sort of fascism and anti-fascism collection, and we wouldn't put a lot of that material out on the library floor. We wouldn't want to put that on an open access platform either. So we've got not a responsibility around making sure that the material we put out there is appropriate and suitable. There's also kind of issues around images and some of the visual material that we have, that even when we've used it ourselves in seminars or for educational purposes, they've been taken sort of and used, decontextualized, tokenized some ways, just because they happen to show diverse images or people of color. And again, that runs a huge risk for us with our community partners and the community groups that we work with. We work really hard to build and sustain relationships with those groups and work in partnership with them, and we're custodians of those stories, so we need to be able to make sure that we're managing those stories really appropriately and sensitively. So with all those kind of constraints, how do we really open up access? So over the pandemic, there's obviously been a sort of a real need and lots of requests for getting our material, and we've worked with volunteers to digitize some of our content. So we digitize excerpts of oral histories. We use SoundCloud and put them on our website so people can access them and get a real flavor of the stories with the emotion, people using their own voice, and a real understanding of some of the history that they're talking about. And then we've also sort of done smaller digitization of different collections, working with our colleagues in Jane's department with the imaging team to put sort of time limited content on some of the platforms so that researchers or community historians or students and educators can access the material. But again, it's much more for us is about making sure the history and the marginalized stories within our collections are visible rather than just in an open access format. So I suppose I'd just ask Jane really how that contrasts with the islands.
I think it's a really interesting one, because obviously while our collections are historic, so we may not have some copyright issues, obviously they're historic, so they may well have some diversity and inclusion and, decolonization issues. And one of the things that really became apparent to us primarily through the pandemic was we had this big push to digitize as much as we could and put everything online. And very quickly we realized that with our new platform, with Manchester Digital Collections, which is intended to be much more open, it's intended that people could take material and do whatever they want with it. We began to really realize we had some serious questions we had to figure out in terms of some of these collections, one of which, an early one, was an anti-slavery collection, which is really important and was put there for researchers, but obviously that brings up a whole load of issues in itself in terms of the material that was in there. So we did do quite a bit of work around content warnings and how we describe things and the contextualization, and it's a big area that we know we need to do a lot more work on. And some of the really simple things in terms of the fact that some of this stuff can be found directly through Google. So we've been trying to look at ways in which we could actually hide images and give people warnings before they see them if there are things that are particularly might be triggers. So I think that's a challenge that we're really working on at the moment. And in terms of you, Safina, working with the communities and looking at that kind of sustainable output as well, and how we can really engage communities and bring them into this kind of the digital collections, digital stories, whatever you want to call it, so that they can own that storytelling area. What sort of stuff are you doing around that?
So yeah, we've been doing lots of work with trying to ensure that community groups that we're working with have sort of the skills, the tools, and the resources to be able to work sort of actively and develop their own sort of digital material and content, but also look at some of the issues and some of the barriers that they have in being able to access the content. So we've been doing a lot of work around providing training and support, sort of coaching and mentoring around not just sort of the oral history trainings, but any kind of heritage work that they want to do that will lead to sort of archive quality deposits, ensuring that they've got the skills, ensuring that they do a lot more work around collecting the permissions and are comfortable with the permissions that they give. So we don't just take we don't take all the copyright. Sometimes we can have shared copyright, sometimes we can have it on loan, sometimes they keep the copyright, but we're the custodians. So we try and be really responsive and flexible so that the stories that they tell, we get to preserve them and make sure that they're there for future generations, but they still have that control and trust. Also during, I suppose, the pandemic as well, it exposed a lot of issues like lack of digital literacy and digital poverty within groups. So it's not just that open access means that everybody can access things digitally. So we've been doing a lot of work, well, how can we make sure that there's access to digital equipment? And also open access to us still means physical access. So we have spaces in our library where people can come and access that material. There's no paywalls, there's no barriers. And I think it's still really unfeasible to kind of go back and try and make our collections fully digital. There's a lot of staff resourcing involved in going through and looking at the gaps in permissions and that, updating to more recent sort of legal requirements and things like that. So we're kind of trying to develop a middle ground to open access, but looking from the lens of the communities that we work with as well.
And I think that communities angle is something we can learn from so much in terms of maybe more traditional collecting and traditional ways of looking at it. And I think one of the challenges is perhaps that we don't, apart from the fact, we don't necessarily acknowledge our privilege, we don't necessarily open out platforms enough to be able to really share things and have a meaningful dialogue, I guess, around the collections as well. But I think there's also a lack of people really discussing the issues there and the kind of the massive problems that you've outlined for us, particularly around the modern and community collections.
Yeah, I think absolutely. The default, I think, is the starting point is always that they're very historic collections that need to be digitized, looking at sort of the technical requirements and sort of the skills and the resources required to do that. And also that the precedent is always about making everything more open and more accessible, but actually for collections like ours that are contemporary, that are complex, have challenging contexts, that can't be the default. So I think definitely policies, procedures, guidelines, when we're having those discussions in institutions as a sector, we need to really think about how we work with communities and the stories that they need to tell, and what kind of policies, procedures and processes they need. And I think, yeah, absolutely. One of the aims in our organisation that we outline is around making sure that we share our platform and our privilege as an institution with the groups that we work with, acknowledging that we do have far more access to skills, tools, resources, information, knowledge than the communities that we work with. And I think there's certainly more that can be done as a sector within higher education, within the heritage sector as well, to sort of start at a different point. start at the point where you don't have access to these things, and begin the dialogue from there. So I wondered, Jane, if just to finish off, you wanted to just share a couple of reflections.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, the really interesting thing is kind of reframing that open access and the idea that digitizing everything, although I never believe in digitizing there will come, I very firmly think you have to put context around it, but that, you know, we need to be doing more than just sharing things. And I think it also really demonstrates that a lot of the conversations we've been having around challenging language and historical descriptions and how those are transferred online or into your asset management system, which I think are really, really valid. I think it's so much wider than that, and maybe we need to start broadening out that conversation a bit more. And Safina, is there anything else you would like to add in terms of reflection?
No, I think you've captured it. I think it's just, yeah, I think we need to start the conversation at a much earlier point and not start the default with everything needs to be digitized for digitizing's sake. I think we're kind of really getting ahead of time, so we need to take some questions.
And there are far more questions than there is time, as often will be the case. Oh, don't be sorry, be happy. Because the dialectic that the two of you have been discussing, the dilemmas and the challenges to look at a continuum of access and engagement, raises so many opportunities for touch points, whether it's the digital enumeration reflection of that, and then just the permissioning and the stresses in that. So I'm going to ask a couple of, let's call them flashcard style questions.
Okay.
So there'd be very quick ones. One is, if you're accessing a collection and people are uploading, if there's a mechanism to voluntarily contribute, do you have a protocol for how you're managing that user or community engagement if they've got metadata they want to contribute?
Do you want me to go?
It's more with you, Safina.
Yeah, Safina.
Yes, we do. And actually, we reviewed and updated and spent quite a lot of time, our archivists, and early on in the pandemic, when we realized that we needed to take in sort of these digital collections. So yeah, we have a whole host of sort of really thought through permissions and forms that you need to complete to do that.
Mm-hmm. And another question, and this is something that in the continual unfolding of can I, should I, can't I, we had a few questions come in about, is there a structure, a metadata structure or a metadata table of rights and permissioning expressions that is being automatically read, or is there more of a procedural workflow, a human workflow?
I suppose
so is there a metadata table with automation? So
no, there isn't. Actually, we did think and we did try to do that, but it's so difficult, and there isn't an existing benchmark that we, or set of standards that we can go to and begin that work. So we've been doing a lot of learning through doing with that process, but yeah, it's definitely through a human sort of flow, as you said. I don't know, Jane, if you wanted.
Yeah, Jane, do you have an opinion about that?
I suppose, yeah, for me, it's been really interesting because we did have that for our own internal image system that would just sort of automatically, but over time we've realized there are a lot of problems with that. So we're actually going back into more of a human oriented approach if we can do that. If we have an entire collection, then that's one thing. But I think with these kind of complexities, there's no replacement, unfortunately, for the human having to go through and check things.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's an intimacy of connection to sensitivity and respect and changing social mores and norms. And we had quite a fascinating question come in that I think should be the topic for a whole session, which in a workflow like this, where the heart and the spirit is access knowledge, socialization, persistence of historical access, how do you assess the negative potential impact of certain holdings that are in the collection? And if you want to just give a general, as we wrap up, a general point of view, and then these questions, of course, are being captured for later discussions.
You can't give me a question like that to
Yeah,
answer.
come on, come on, Safina, I've got my watch on.
Okay, but I would just say it's done iteratively. It's really difficult. Views change, you know, terminology changes. So I think it's quite complex, but a lot of it is I suppose assessed on kind of the current thinking, and I mean, some of it is quite easy. It doesn't take quite a lot of people to decide where some material is thoroughly offensive and very difficult. But there are more nuanced material out there where you really do have to think about, well, actually, and there are issues of kind of censorship and things that come in. So what we say is everything is accessible, but some things we need to think about sort of, you know, how easy they are to access. So we wouldn't put them out on the library, we wouldn't put them on our platforms. But yeah, that's not an easy question, and we do continually debate that on some, you know, some of the content that we have.
Yeah,
Jane,
I think I'd just say the job is never done, and it's a constant process of going back and checking and looking again, and perhaps when we come to terminology, some of the things that were fine 10, 20 years ago are definitely not fine now. So I think it is that continual process of going back and checking, and the job is never done, I suppose I would say.
Yes, I know it's such a fascinating area, whether it's the particulars of, say, something like gendered terms, and then gendered colors, something that toy manufacturers had to cope with. That's in an allied conversation to this, without the cultural, well, certainly with cultural impact, but of a different, maybe specific gravity. Both of you have provided a lot of insight into an issue that contains so much importance for how we continue to move forward with how do we share knowledge, how do we describe assets, how do we open access, and how do we govern this. I hope that we'll have the chance to have you back at another Henry Stewart event, or in one of the other many educational settings that afford the opportunity for us to have these discussions. And with that said, I'd like to thank both of you for your time, and we've enjoyed getting to know you while working on the conference. For those of you who are looking for, we have a next session coming up about Torrentia and AI and video. Please do join check out the lounge tab for the facilitated roundtable discussions, which will be quite interesting to hear from many of our speakers who are going to join those roundtables. So Jane and Safina, thank you. We hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.